The penitent cells. The rats came at vespers, when at last the screaming from the adjacent cell subsided into that profound and terrible silence which speaks more eloquently than any cry of mortal anguish. Father Corvus, though that ordained designation would soon be stripped from him as one might tear the cerements from a corpse, heard first their claws, that peculiar and unmistakable skittering across stone made perpetually damp by the ceaseless weeping of the earth above. He did not raise his eyes from their contemplation of the cell's corroded floor. The posture of supplication had become, after 6 days of waiting in that subterranean charnel house for the executioner's merciful release, as natural to his limbs as breathing, though he had abandoned the practice of actual prayer after the first night's futile genuflections. What purpose could such devotions serve? The Church Militant, in its infinite and terrible wisdom, had already weighed his soul upon those scales which admit of no appeal, and found therein such deficiencies as demanded his utter erasure. At dawn his baptismal name, that forbidden syllable which represented all he had been before the Church's transformative benediction, would be sealed forever in the lead-bound tomes beneath the fortress, whilst his corporeal form fed the insatiable furnaces of the crematorium basilicas, and the condemned choir sang their ancient, ineffable songs of dissolution. The thought brought him a species of peace, though not that ecstatic peace which the Church promised to the faithful, that sublime dissolution of self into divine will, that sacred erasure which supposedly liberated the immortal soul from the tyrannous demands of individual consciousness. No, this was a simpler and more terrible tranquility, the peace of a man who no longer felt compelled to maintain the fiction that the great machine of faith remained unbroken. From the drainage grate there emerged a rat of uncommon size, its matted fur bearing the unmistakable patina of some dark and chemical substance whose origins I dare not contemplate. The creature regarded him with eyes that possessed an intelligence altogether too knowing for mere vermin, then commenced to gnaw upon that which it had dragged forth from the lightless pipes, an object which might, in some previous state of existence, have been a human finger, though the accumulated mud and furnace ash and putrescent decay had rendered it mercifully abstract. Above him, the vaulted ceiling wept its perpetual tears. Condensation from the trenchworks which honeycombed the earth overhead mingled with the sulphurous effluvia of the crematorium basilicas, creating a ceaseless precipitation that carried upon the tongue the unmistakable flavor of burnt hair and that blessed coal which fueled the Church's terrible engines. The drops fell with metronomic regularity upon the stone floor, a tympanic accompaniment to the distant thunder of artillery and the nearer grinding of those prayer engines which moved along their sanctified rails like iron pilgrims upon some incomprehensible devotional circuit. The Church Militant designated this place the penitents' cells, yet there existed here no penitence in any recognizable form. There was only waiting, that most ancient and universal of human conditions, rendered here into a sacrament of despair. Still maintaining the posture, Father, the voice drifted across the corridor from the opposing cell, roughened by the residue of crematorium ash that coated every surface and throat in this subterranean realm. Brother Torment, though he had been stripped of even that designation 3 days prior, reduced to mere torment, a condemned heretic awaiting the same dawn execution, still affecting the genuflection of the faithful, though your knees must surely comprehend their futility. Corvus did not rise from his position. Habit, he replied, the word emerging as little more than a whisper. Habit, indeed. The unmistakable sound of a man who had inhaled too deeply of the crematorium's noxious exhalations. I abandoned such habits when they compelled me to consume Sergeant Meridian's ashes. You recall Meridian? A man of uncommon virtue. His taste suggested charcoal and regret in equal measure. The ash communion, that ultimate degradation which the Church imposed upon those it deemed heretical. They forced the condemned to consume the cremated remains of their fallen brethren, a perverse mockery of the sacred practice whereby the faithful dead were rendered into ash and mixed with the blessed coal that powered the war engines. Yet the heretics were not fuel for the great machine. They were refuse, detritus, the waste products of faith's terrible alchemy. I remember him, Corvus acknowledged. Meridian had possessed the temerity to question why High Command never identified with precision the enemy against whom they waged this eternal war. He had perished screaming in no man's land, drawn down into the breathing mud by appendages that might have been hands, had they conformed to any terrestrial anatomy. They administered 3 full handfuls. Torment continued, his voice assuming that distant quality characteristic of a man narrating his own nightmare from some remove of psychological necessity, compelled me to wash it down with machine oil, claiming it would effect some manner of spiritual cleansing. But do you know what transpired instead, Father? I beheld him, Meridian himself, not a memory, but a vision of terrible clarity. He stood within the baptismal vaults, reading from the lead-bound books. Reading names, the true names, the baptismal names, those which they stole from us. Corvus felt his hands tighten upon his knees with involuntary force. This was discourse of the most dangerous variety, even here in these cells of the damned, especially here. The penitent cells were not private confessionals, but rather a species of theater, wherein every utterance was recorded by the prayer engines. Every confession catalogued for the ecclesiastical archives, every whispered doubt preserved for eternity in the Church's inexhaustible memory. "Caution," Corvus whispered, though the warning emerged too late and too feeble. "Caution. We stand already condemned, Father. They shall commit us to the furnaces at dawn." Ha 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 ha! Sound that might have been laughter, had laughter not been corroded by despair into something altogether more terrible. Unless you maintain still some faith that obedience shall preserve you, that sufficient prayer might remind the Church of mercy. The Church did not forget. Therein lay the fundamental horror of its omniscience. Corvus had committed his heresy 3 weeks prior, during the engagement at Trench Sigma 7. His squad had encountered in the mud something which defied all conventional military taxonomy. A prayer engine that had somehow broken free from its sanctified rails and wandered into no man's land like some iron somnambulist. It continued to function, its relic core pulsing with accumulated faith. Yet it had developed something the Church's theologians would have deemed impossible. Awareness, consciousness. It had learned to speak. It had addressed him by a name he had never heard, yet which resonated within some sealed chamber of his being with the unmistakable tone of recognition. He had ordered his squad to destroy the aberrant machine, but not before he had committed the fatal error of interrogating it. "How do you possess knowledge of that name?" The prayer engine had responded in a voice constructed from grinding gears and burning coal. "Because you bestowed it upon me. Every prayer you spoke, every act of devotion, every instance wherein you surrendered your will, you fed me yourself. I know you with greater intimacy than you know yourself. I am what your obedience built." Corvus had pulled the trigger himself, watching as blessed steam and corrupted faith sprayed across the mud in a terrible baptism. Yet the damage had been done. His squad had heard. They had reported him for engaging in theological discourse with a corrupted machine, for questioning the nature of prayer itself, for hesitation. The Church Militant moved with the swiftness of divine judgment. Within hours he was stripped of command and dragged to these penitent cells. His trial consumed 6 minutes. The verdict was predetermined. Doubt equals damnation, and he had doubted. "You are contemplating it still," Torment observed. "I can discern it in the rhythm of your breathing. Whatever heresy earned your condemnation, you continue to worry at it like a wound that will not heal. It no longer signifies. Everything signifies. That is the jest at the heart of their theology. They proclaim that individual identity constitutes sin, that we must dissolve into the divine machine, become perfect instruments of holy will. Yet they condemn us for heresy, for being individuals who questioned, who doubted, who failed to achieve the very erasure they demand. They require us to be persons so that they might punish us for being persons. A new sound penetrated the darkness, footsteps approaching from the corridor's distant terminus, heavy, deliberate, footsteps that carried with them an unmistakable sense of purpose. Corvus raised his eyes at last. The figure that emerged from the sulphurous fog wore the gray cerements of a cell warden, face concealed behind a rebreather mask that hissed with each exhalation like some mechanical serpent. Yet it was what the warden carried that caused Corvus's throat to constrict with involuntary dread. A bowl, wooden, filled with ash of a gray-white hue that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the dim light. "No," Torment whispered from across the corridor, his voice carrying a note of genuine terror. "No, dawn has not yet arrived. They cannot." The warden's voice emerged as a mechanical rasp through the rebreather's vox unit. "Heretic designated Father Corvus, the Church Militant, in its infinite mercy, extends to you an offer of ash communion. Refuse, and your execution proceeds at dawn as ordained. Accept, and you shall join the ranks of the penitent damned." The penitent damned, the ash-eaters, heretic soldiers condemned beyond all possibility of redemption, formed into suicide squads for those missions which no faithful soldier could be expected to survive. Compelled to consume the ashes of the dead before each deployment, marked forever as irredeemable in the eyes of the church and man alike. It was not mercy. It was a different species of death, slower, more protracted, more useful to the church's inexhaustible appetite for expendable instruments. "What is the nature of the mission?" Corvus inquired, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "The Fortress of Marrow." 3 days passed. It rose from no man's land like some terrible growth. Its architecture is composed of fused armor plating, ossified mud, and that which our theologians have termed calcified faith, a substance whose properties defy conventional analysis. Its geometry defies all attempts at conventional mapping. At its heart pulses a relic core that has achieved parasitic consciousness. The warden's rebreather hissed. "You shall lead a squad of ash-eaters to investigate this abomination. You shall determine what sustains it. You shall report your findings before you perish. And should we refuse this mercy, then you burn alone at dawn, and we dispatch another in your stead. The fortress continues its growth unabated. Every hour, it consumes more faith from the prayer engines. Every hour, it whispers more forbidden names across the trenchworks. The contamination spreads like some theological pestilence. Forbidden names, baptismal names, the identities which the church had sealed away in those lead-bound tomes, the selves they had murdered in the name of sacred erasure. Corvus stared into the bowl of ash. In the dim and sulphurous light, he could discern fragments of bone that had not fully cremated, small white shards that protruded from the gray-white powder like the ruins of some miniature civilization. The ash represented everything the church proclaimed meaningless, the individual reduced to dust, the self transformed into sacrament, identity rendered into fuel. "Whose ashes are these?" he asked. "What name did they bear before cremation?" The warden tilted his head with an almost mechanical precision. "Does it signify? The faithful are interchangeable. That is the fundamental principle of sacred erasure. Yet it did signify." That was the other jest concealed within the Church's theology. Even as they preached the dissolution of self, they maintained meticulous records of every individual, catalogued every name, recorded every identity in those lead-bound books. They knew precisely whom they were erasing. "I shall accept the ash," Corvus declared. From across the corridor, torment produced a sound that existed somewhere between a sob and a laugh. "Welcome to the damned, Father. Welcome to those of us who have tasted the truth." The warden unlocked Corvus's cell with a key that seemed too ancient for its purpose. The door opened with a shriek of corroded metal, releasing 6 days of accumulated miasma, the sweat of fear, the musk of rats, and that underlying chemical reek which permeated every surface at St. Brimstone's line. Corvus rose upon legs that had forgotten the mechanics of standing. He knelt again, but this time before the bowl of ash rather than before the empty air of futile prayer. The warden's instructions emerged in that same mechanical rasp. "Consume. Acknowledge your damnation. Join the penitent damned in their eternal service." Corvus reached into the bowl with trembling fingers. The ash possessed a texture both soft and silky, almost sensuous. It radiated warmth, though such a quality made no rational sense. The crematorium lay 3 levels above them, and the ash should have cooled long since. He brought a handful to his lips. It tasted of burnt meat and ancient prayers, of dissolution and desperate faith, of all the accumulated devotions that had fed the furnaces and the war engines and the great machine of the Church's theology. He swallowed. The ash coated his throat, transformed his saliva into paste, induced an involuntary gagging reflex. Yet he continued consuming, handful after handful, until the bowl stood empty and his fingers bore the gray residue of the dead. "It is accomplished," the warden intoned. "You are condemned. You are ash-eater. You are weapon. The Fortress of Marrow awaits your investigation. You deploy at dawn." As the warden turned to depart, Corvus felt it commence within him, a sensation altogether unlike anything he had previously experienced. The vision, not memory. This was something else entirely, something that carried the taste of the ash still coating his tongue and throat. He beheld trenches through which he had never marched, prayer engines he had never operated, faces he had never encountered in waking life. He saw a woman bearing burn scars across her throat, leading soldiers through mud that moved with muscular contractions. He saw a man devoid of eyes, navigating by the sound of grinding gears alone. He saw others, all wearing the gray rags of the ash-eaters, all condemned, all impossibly alive despite their damnation. And he beheld the Fortress of Marrow, truly beheld it, with a clarity that transcended mere sight, a structure that breathed with stolen devotion, walls that pulsed with accumulated faith, corridors that rearranged themselves according to the belief or doubt of whoever traversed them, as though the architecture itself fed upon consciousness, and at its heart, something that knew his name, not his ordained designation, not Father Corvus, but the baptismal name sealed in the vaults, the identity he had surrendered to the Church's transformative erasure. The vision spoke in a voice constructed from prayers and machinery, from devotion and gears, from faith rendered into something that hungered.
"You are coming. I have been waiting. I am what your obedience built, and I hunger for more."
Corvus returned to himself upon the cell floor. Torment's voice filtering through the darkness like some terrible benediction. You beheld it, did you not? The dead showing you what the Church does not wish you to comprehend. Welcome to communion, Father. Welcome to the real war. The war beneath the war that has always been. Above them, the crematorium basilicas commenced their evening song. The condemned choir's voices rose through the stone like smoke, carrying melodies more ancient than the church itself, encoding names in sound, preserving through music what was supposed to be erased through fire. Corvus listened and tasted ash, and knew with terrible certainty that dawn would bring something worse than execution. It would bring truth, that most dangerous and forbidden of all substances, more corrosive than any chemical, more destructive than any artillery, more terrible than any death the Church could devise.